Every legendary film starts somewhere, and for Back to the Future, it began with a single what if. In 1980, writing partners Robert Zemeckis and Bob Gale started tossing around an idea. What would happen if someone traveled back in time and ran into their own parents as teenagers? That simple premise eventually grew into one of the most beloved films in Hollywood history. But getting there was anything but easy. When Zemeckis and Gale first shopped the script around, more than 40 studios turned it down. The rejection wasn't because the story lacked promise. It was because, by the standards of early 1980s comedy, the script was considered too tame. Studios at the time were chasing raunchier, edgier humor, and a heartfelt, family-friendly time travel comedy didn't fit the mold they were looking for. The tide turned in 1984, when Zemeckis directed Romancing the Stone and watched it become a genuine box office hit. Overnight, he went from a filmmaker studios doubted to one they wanted to work with. Universal Pictures finally agreed to back the project, and production could begin. Even with a studio attached, the road wasn't smooth. Zemeckis and Gale had always envisioned Michael J. Fox as Marty McFly, convinced his charisma and comedic timing were exactly what the role needed. Unfortunately, Fox was tied up filming his sitcom Family Ties, and the show's producers wouldn't let him go. So the part was handed to Eric Stoltz instead. Stoltz spent weeks in the role, but something wasn't clicking. He was a talented performer, but his interpretation of Marty leaned too serious for a character meant to feel playful and easygoing. Eventually, Zemeckis made the costly call to recast the part, tossing out weeks of footage and spending significantly more money to bring in Fox after all. Filming finally wrapped in April 1985, but the crew was left with almost no breathing room before the planned July 3rd release date, meaning editing and special effects had to be rushed. Not every visual effect was fully polished when the movie hit theaters, yet none of that mattered to audiences. The film exploded at the box office, pulling in roughly $381 million worldwide and becoming 1985's top-grossing release. It resonated with critics, families, and teenagers alike, and the soundtrack, anchored by Huey Lewis and the News, became a cultural staple. The DeLorean itself became one of cinema's most recognizable vehicles. The film's legacy only deepened with time. In 2007, the Library of Congress selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry, cementing its place not just as entertainment, but as a piece of American cultural history. Behind that polished final product, though, was a production defined by last-minute casting swaps, brutal rejection, and constant pressure. Struggles most audiences never noticed while they were busy quoting Doc Brown. George McFly, played by Crispin Glover in the original film, was one of the story's most memorable characters, awkward and timid at first, but ultimately someone who finds the courage to stand up for himself. Glover's performance gave the role its heart. So when Back to the Future Part 2 arrived in 1989, longtime fans noticed something felt slightly wrong about George. That's because it wasn't Glover on screen at all. The role had been recast with actor Jeffrey Weissman, who wore prosthetics modeled from a mold of Glover's own face from the first movie. The popular assumption was that Glover simply declined to return. The real story was more complicated. Glover has explained that he was open to coming back, but the pay offer was far lower than what other cast members were receiving. He also had creative disagreements with the filmmakers, particularly over the first film's ending, which he felt implied that wealth was the key to a happier life. Once talks broke down, the production decided to move forward without him. But instead of simply casting someone new, they used the existing facial mold to make Weissman resemble Glover as closely as possible. When Glover found out, he wasn't upset that another actor took the role. What angered him was that his likeness had been used without his permission. He ultimately filed a lawsuit, which was settled out of court, but the case raised bigger questions that Hollywood hadn't fully grappled with before. Who actually owns the rights to an actor's face? And where does the studio's creative freedom end when it comes to someone's personal image? The fallout from the case reshaped how actor contracts were written going forward, with studios adding much clearer language about how a performer's likeness could and couldn't be used. Decades later, in an era of CGI de-aging and AI-generated faces, the questions Glover's case first raised feel more relevant than ever. Marty McFly skateboards, shreds a guitar solo, and handles himself like a natural in nearly every setting the trilogy throws at him. What audiences may not realize is that Michael J. Fox had to learn almost all of it from scratch, often while juggling a packed television schedule on Family Ties. Fox once joked that it felt like he was permanently back in school, and that wasn't much of an exaggeration. Between skateboarding lessons, guitar practice, horseback riding, and firearms training, he was constantly picking up new skills under tight deadlines. One of his most celebrated moments, the Johnny Be Good performance at the school dance, required him to learn guitar technique down to the smallest detail. Even though the music itself had already been recorded, Fox worked with a guitar teacher to match his finger movements exactly to the sound, and studied classic rock performers to nail the stage presence, jumps, and slides that made the scene so memorable. Skateboarding presented its own hurdle. At the time, the sport was still viewed mainly as a casual street activity, rather than something meant for cinematic stunts. So Fox trained extensively to look convincing on camera. By the time filming began, he could ride and balance as if he'd been doing for years. Part 3 asked even more of him, sending Marty into the Old West and requiring Fox to learn horseback riding, roping, and gun handling. He later admitted, with some humor, that he'd absorbed a huge range of skills over the course of the trilogy, but had since forgotten most of them, a fair reflection of how intensely compressed his training schedule really was. The filmmakers also pushed technology to keep up with his performance. When later films needed multiple versions of Marty interacting on screen at once, Industrial Light and Magic built a robotic motion control camera system called the VistaGlide, allowing scenes with two Martys to look completely seamless. Even with all that effort, a handful of continuity errors slipped past the editors and stayed in the finished films. The most famous involves the videotape Marty uses to explain time travel to the 1955 version of Doc Brown. In the scene where Marty originally records a message, the camera is angled down at his side, never actually pointed at document. Yet when the tape plays back for younger Doc, his explanation is somehow captured perfectly. It's a detail few viewers caught on the first watch, but one that became impossible to unsee once fans pointed it out. The Save the Clock Tower flyer has its own inconsistencies. Its condition shifts from crisp and new to worn and wrinkled throughout the film, and in one scene Jennifer's handwriting is already visible on the back before she's actually written anything. There's also a background extra who appears to walk past the same spot more than once during the clock tower scene, a small continuity slip that, fittingly for a time travel movie, almost looks intentional. Smaller errors to Trilogy 2, a hand seen flipping through a phone book that looks noticeably older than Marty's, a remote control reading 0 volts while still somehow powering the DeLorean, and lighting that shifts oddly within a single hallway scene. None of it was planned, but fans have turned spotting these details into part of the fun of rewatching films. One of the film's most quietly powerful moments has nothing to do with special effects. When Marty tells 1955 Doc Brown that Ronald Reagan will be president in 1985, Doc's stunned reaction, disbelief that a Hollywood actor could ever hold the office, became one of the film's funniest jokes, precisely because Reagan really had been a well-known film actor before entering politics. Reagan reportedly enjoyed the joke.